Daniel was only 12 when he first began to understand that his home was not like the others. From the outside, their house looked ordinary, a modest two-story building tucked into a quiet neighborhood. The garden was neat, the curtains always drawn at the right angle, the lights switching on at the same time each evening. But behind those closed doors lived a family ruled not by warmth or laughter, but by silence, order, and fear. His father, Mr. Robert, was a man of routine. A retired military officer, he believed discipline was the backbone of life, and without it, chaos would devour everything. To him, rules were not guidelines, they were sacred laws, and punishment, in his eyes, was not cruelty, but a necessary medicine, bitter in taste, but vital for growth. Daniel's mother rarely spoke against her husband. She moved quietly through the house, ensuring that nothing disrupted his order. Dinner was always on the table at exactly 7 p.m. The TV volume never crossed a certain level. Even laughter from Daniel had to be measured. Too loud, and his father's glare would silence him instantly. For a child, such an environment was confusing. Daniel loved his father. He admired his strength, the authority he carried wherever he went, but he also feared him. Every step, every word felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one small mistake, and he knew what would come, the punishment. It wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was hours of cold silence, his father refusing to acknowledge him, making the boy feel invisible in his own home. Sometimes it was a lecture, sharp words cutting deeper than any belt could. But there were nights, dark, unforgettable nights, when silence and words were replaced by the sting of leather or the sharp swoosh of a wooden cane. Daniel did not think of himself as a bad child. He tried his best to obey, to keep his grades up, to respect his parents. Yet, like any boy, curiosity and impulsiveness often pulled him toward mistakes, and in his father's world, mistakes were crimes. It was a late autumn evening when Daniel committed what he would later call his first real crime. His teacher had given him a mathematics assignment, one he struggled to complete. Instead of admitting he didn't understand, Daniel copied the answers from a friend. The next day, when Mr. Robert inspected his notebook, as he often did, he immediately noticed something odd. The handwriting of the solutions was slightly different. The steps didn't match Daniel's usual work. His father's eyes narrowed. "Did you do this yourself?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. The truth trembled on his tongue, but the fear of disappointing his father, the fear of punishment, forced the lie out of him. "Yes, father, I solved it myself." For a moment, the room froze. His father stared at him, not blinking. Then without another word, he placed the notebook on the table and walked away. Daniel thought he had escaped, but deep down, an unease grew in his chest. He didn't yet know his father's psychology, didn't understand that Mr. Robert was not a man easily fooled. He was like a hunter who could smell dishonesty in the air. That evening, dinner was unusually silent, even for their household. His mother glanced nervously between father and son, sensing the tension. Daniel kept his head down, pushing food around his plate. When the meal ended, Mr. Robert spoke calmly, almost too calmly. "Daniel, meet me in the study." The boy's heart dropped. His worst fears were confirmed. The study was a room Daniel hated entering. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with military books, biographies of great leaders, and thick manuals about discipline and order. In one corner stood an old wooden cane, polished and gleaming as though it were a prized possession. His father sat behind the desk, hands folded, eyes cold. "Do you know what I despise the most?" he asked. Daniel swallowed. "Lying, sir." "Correct. And do you know why lying is worse than failure?" Daniel shook his head. "Because failure is an attempt that went wrong. Lying is a deliberate betrayal." The words sliced through the boy. He wanted to cry, to confess, but fear had chained his tongue. That night, punishment did not come immediately. His father believed in anticipation as a tool. Psychological punishment before the physical one. Daniel was sent to his room with the words, "Tomorrow, after school, we will deal with this."
The boy could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making his stomach twist. He imagined the sting of the cane, the disappointment in his father's eyes, the silence that would follow. By the time morning came, Daniel was exhausted, his mind heavy with dread. At school, he couldn't concentrate. Every tick of the clock dragged him closer to his sentence. His friends laughed, played, shared jokes, but Daniel sat alone, a prisoner of his own thoughts. By the time he returned home, he almost wished the punishment would just happen, just so the waiting could end. That evening, Mr. Robert explained his philosophy. He told Daniel, "A lie is like a seed of rot. If I let it grow, it will destroy your character. I'd rather you hate me today than grow up weak tomorrow." This was his father's dark psychology. He believed love was secondary to discipline, and that true parenting meant breaking a child's spirit of rebellion before it could fully form. And so punishment became not just an act of correction, but a ritual, a performance of power, fear, and control. As Daniel stood in the study, trembling before the wooden cane, he realized that his childhood would never be the same. That night, when Daniel entered the study after school, the room felt colder than usual. The heavy curtains blocked out the late afternoon sun, leaving only a dim glow from the desk lamp. His father was already waiting, standing beside the chair with that polished wooden cane resting in his hand. Daniel's chest tightened, his throat dry, his legs heavy as though he were walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. "Close the door," his father said. The boy obeyed, the soft click of the door sealing him in a world where there was no escape. His father's face was calm, his voice controlled, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made Daniel tremble. For a long moment, the silence stretched. Then his father began to speak. "You think you can deceive me," he said slowly. "You think a lie will protect you from failure, but all you have done is prove that you value comfort more than honesty." His hand tapped the cane lightly against his palm. "Do you understand what that means, Daniel?" The boy nodded quickly, his eyes already stinging with tears. "Yes, father, I'm sorry." "Sorry is cheap," his father replied coldly. "A lie is not erased by words. It must be carved out of you, so you will never dare to repeat it." Daniel wanted to plead, to explain that he was only scared, that he hadn't wanted to disappoint him, but the words froze in his mouth. Fear held him still, silent, powerless. His father pointed to the chair in the middle of the room. "Bend over." The boy's knees shook as he stepped forward. His small hands gripped the edge of the chair tightly as he leaned over. Every second stretched like eternity. He could hear his father breathing behind him, steady, almost mechanical. Then came the first sharp swish of the cane cutting through the air, followed by a searing pain across his skin. Daniel gasped, his body jerking instinctively, but the firm voice came instantly. "Do not move." Another strike followed, and another. Each one left behind not just pain but a mark, invisible yet deeply etched into the boy's memory. The sound of the cane striking echoed in the room, mingling with his stifled cries. His father did not shout, did not lose control. He delivered each stroke with precision, as though he were carrying out a duty, not venting anger. That calmness made it worse, because it showed Daniel that this was not rage. It was a deliberate choice. By the time the punishment ended, the boy's tears had soaked his cheeks. He remained bent over in the chair, trembling, unable to lift himself. His father finally spoke, his voice quieter now, but firm. "You will remember this pain every time you think of lying. And when you grow up, you will thank me for it. The world does not forgive dishonesty. Better you learn that truth here, under this roof, than out there where it will destroy you." Daniel wiped his face with his sleeve, but the words cut deeper than the cane. He wanted to scream that he didn't understand, that he only wanted his father's love, not his discipline, but he stayed silent. Somewhere inside, he felt a small part of his innocence break. When his father dismissed him, he stumbled out of the study, clutching the doorknob with shaking hands. His mother was waiting in the hallway, her face pale, her lips pressed together as if she wanted to speak but dared not. She reached out, brushing his shoulder gently, but the boy pulled away, ashamed of his tears. Without a word, he rushed to his room and closed the door. That night, lying in bed, Daniel stared at the ceiling. His body ached, but it was not the physical pain that kept him awake. It was the echo of his father's words. He replayed them again and again. Better you learn it here. Better you remember this pain. The punishment had left more than marks on his skin. It had planted fear inside him, a seed that would grow every time he thought of making a mistake. He realized then that his father's power was not just in the cane, but in his ability to control Daniel's thoughts. Even the idea of lying again seemed unbearable, not because of guilt, but because of the memory of pain waiting behind it. This was his father's psychology, dark and deliberate, to shape his son not with gentle guidance, but with fear, guilt, and submission.
Days passed after that first serious punishment, but the shadow of it never left Daniel's mind. Every time he opened his school notebook, every time he looked at the wooden cane resting in the corner of his father's study, the memory returned like a ghost. He tried harder than ever to stay obedient, finishing homework early, speaking politely, lowering his eyes whenever his father spoke. But even in obedience, there was no peace. He lived in constant fear that another mistake, no matter how small, would bring back the storm. It wasn't long before it happened again. This time, it wasn't a lie. Daniel had come home late after school because he stopped to play soccer with some friends. Just 30 minutes late, but in his father's eyes, it was an act of disobedience, a dangerous crack in discipline. "If you can ignore one rule," Mr. Roberts said coldly, "soon you will ignore them all." The punishment followed, swift and precise, leaving Daniel once again in tears, curled in his bed with a burning shame in his chest. The punishments began to multiply. For small things, forgetting to polish his shoes, leaving a book out of place, speaking too casually. Each time his father's words were the same. "This is for your own good. You will thank me when you're a man." But Daniel could not imagine thanking anyone for this. To him, it felt like living under a sentence where trial and execution were one and the same. What confused him most was the calmness of it all. His father never looked wild with rage. He never screamed or lost control. He punished with the same discipline he demanded from others. It was like a ritual, cold and deliberate. Sometimes that made it even worse, because Daniel knew it wasn't anger driving those punishments. It was choice. His father chose this path, believed in it as though it were truth carved in stone. One evening after another round of discipline for leaving a glass on the table, Daniel overheard his parents speaking in low voices. His mother's words were trembling. "Robert, he's just a boy. You're too hard on him. He cries himself to sleep." His father's reply was sharp. "Do you think the world will go easy on him? Do you think life cares about his tears? Better he learns here, under my roof, than be broken out there. I will not raise a weak man." That night, lying awake, Daniel realized something he had never understood before. His father wasn't cruel by accident. He truly believed this was love. To him, punishment was not destruction, but construction, a way to carve strength out of weakness, like a sculptor chiseling stone. But to Daniel, it felt as though each strike chipped away not at weakness, but at his heart. As months turned into years, the punishments became less about the mistakes Daniel made and more about the lessons his father wanted to teach. If Daniel argued, even respectfully, the cane was waiting. If he hesitated in his chores, his father would see it as laziness that needed correction. Soon, Daniel wasn't even sure what counted as a mistake anymore. The boundaries blurred until fear itself became his daily companion. And yet, in his father's eyes, this was progress. "You are becoming disciplined," he would say. "I can see it in your posture, in your silence. You are learning control." But what Daniel felt wasn't control, it was suppression. He was learning not to express, not to question, not to hope. He was learning how to live like a shadow of himself. One rainy night, When the sound of thunder echoed through the house, Daniel gathered the courage to ask a question that had been burning inside him for years. After his punishment for speaking out of turn during dinner, he whispered, his voice shaking, "Father, why do you do this? Why do you hurt me if you love me?" Mr. Robert paused, the cane still in his hand. For the first time his face softened, though only slightly. He sat down, staring at the floor as though speaking to ghosts from his past. "When I was your age," he said quietly, "my father was stricter than I am. He believed weakness was a disease. I grew up fearing him, but that fear made me a man. I went to war. I led soldiers. I survived where others failed. Do you think I could have done that if I had been raised with softness? No. Discipline saved me. Pain saved me. And now I pass that same gift to you." Daniel listened, stunned. It was the first time his father had spoken of his own childhood. In that moment, the boy saw not just a strict father, but a man shaped by his own wounds. It was like looking into a mirror of generations, pain handed down from father to son like an heirloom. But instead of comfort, the explanation only deepened his confusion. Was love nothing more than survival? Was pain the only language fathers knew to speak to their sons? If so, what would that mean for his future? Would he too, one day, hold a cane over his own child, believing it was love? The thought haunted him. And as he lay in bed that night, the rain still tapping against the windows, Daniel made a quiet vow to himself. He would endure, he would survive, but he would never become his father. Yet deep inside, a darker fear lingered. What if he had no choice? The older Daniel grew, the deeper the shadows inside him stretched. At school, he was quiet, polite, and obedient. Teachers praised him for his discipline, his neat work, his respectful tone. Other children admired his focus, sometimes even envied it. But none of them saw the storm raging underneath. They didn't know that every perfect line in his notebook, every straight posture in class, came not from confidence, but from fear. Whenever he made a mistake in front of his teachers, he would feel his chest tighten, not because he feared their disapproval, but because he imagined what would happen once he got home. A wrong answer in math, a missed assignment, even a note about talking too much. Each of these felt like a death sentence. Sometimes the anxiety grew so strong that his hands would shake during tests, his pencil trembling as though his father's cane was already in the room, waiting. His friends invited him to play, but Daniel often refused, not because he didn't want to, but because the thought of coming home late, dirty, or with unfinished homework was unbearable. He lived inside invisible chains, avoiding laughter, avoiding risk. Childhood, which should have been full of curiosity and mistakes, became a prison of silence. At home, he hardly spoke unless spoken to. He answered with, "Yes, father," or "No, father," his voice low, steady, trained. His mother noticed the change, her eyes often lingering on him with quiet sorrow. Sometimes she would try to comfort him in small ways, slipping an extra piece of dessert on his plate, brushing his hair back gently as he sat reading. But she never interfered when his father punished him. She too lived under the same rule of fear, her resistance silenced long ago. Daniel often wondered if she wanted to fight for him, to stand between him and the cane. But she never did. And so, part of his resentment turned towards her as well. He felt abandoned, as though no one in the house truly saw him, not as a son, not as a child, but only as a project in his father's philosophy of discipline. As punishments repeated, something inside Daniel began to split. On the surface, he was obedient, but beneath, in the privacy of his thoughts, a silent rebellion grew. He hated the cane,
hated the cold logic of his punishments. Sometimes he imagined running away, disappearing into the world where his father's rules couldn't reach him. Other times, darker thoughts entered his mind, wishing his father would one day know what it felt like to be powerless, to tremble under someone else's authority. But whenever these thoughts grew too strong, guilt followed. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "This is for your own good. You will thank me." The boy would curl into his bed, ashamed of his hatred, convinced that maybe he really was weak. Maybe his father was right. The cycle of rebellion and guilt became his daily torment. One evening, after another punishment for failing to greet his father properly, Daniel sat by his window, staring into the night sky. He whispered to himself, "I don't know who I am anymore." He felt like two people living in the same body. One, the obedient son shaped by fear. The other, a hidden child desperate to scream, to run, to be free. In the years that followed, this division only deepened. His father's punishments became less frequent, but not because Daniel was no longer making mistakes. It was because he had learned to erase them before they happened. He spoke less, smiled less, dreamed less. He learned how to anticipate his father's moods, how to avoid triggers, how to disappear into silence. To outsiders, he looked like the perfect son, disciplined, respectful, serious beyond his age, but inside, he was hollow.
Daniel was 15 when the breaking point arrived. It was a late summer evening, the air heavy with heat and the smell of rain about to fall. He had spent the day at school preparing for exams, drained and anxious, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of freedom. His best friend, Mark, convinced him to stay after class for a group study session. For 2 hours, Daniel laughed, worked through problems, even allowed himself to forget the weight of discipline. By the time he reached home, dusk had already fallen. The lights of the house glowed faintly in the darkness, and his stomach sank. He was late. Almost 2 hours late. He froze at the door, considering whether to lie, but knew his father's eyes would see through him instantly. There was no hiding this. Inside, the house was silent. His father sat at the dining table, a book open in front of him, glasses perched on his nose. He looked up slowly when Daniel entered. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "You are late." His father's voice was calm, too calm. "I was studying, Father, with Mark, for the exams." "Without permission." Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes, Father." The pause that followed felt like eternity. Then his father rose, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the corner of the room where the cane rested. For the first time in years, something in Daniel snapped. He could not bear it, not this time, not for a mistake born of something as innocent as study. His chest burned with a mixture of fear and rage, years of silence pressing against his ribs until it exploded. "No!" The word tore from his throat before he could stop it. "I won't do this anymore." His father froze, the cane halfway lifted. His eyes narrowed, studying the boy before him. "What did you say?" Daniel's hands trembled, but his voice was louder now, desperate. "I'm not weak. I'm not lazy. I studied. I did nothing wrong. You don't get to hurt me just because you think it makes me strong." The silence after those words was heavier than any punishment he had ever received. His father stared at him, as though seeing him for the first time, as though the obedient child he had carved for years had suddenly vanished, replaced by someone unrecognizable. The cane lowered slowly. His father's face hardened, but his voice cracked, the faintest tremor beneath the iron. "So, you think you know better than me now? You think pain taught you nothing? Look at yourself. Every bit of discipline you have, every ounce of strength, you owe to me." Tears blurred Daniel's eyes, but his voice didn't break. "I'm not strong because of you. I'm strong in spite of you." For a long moment, neither of them moved.
The air vibrated with unspoken words, with generations of pain colliding in that one room. Daniel half expected the cane to fall harder than ever, to feel the fury of defiance answered with fire. But it never came. His father's grip loosened, the cane dropping softly against the wall. He turned away, shoulders heavy, as if the weight of his own past had suddenly become too much to bear. Daniel stood frozen, chest heaving, unable to believe what had just happened. For the first time, he had stood against the man who ruled his life and survived. It was a small victory, but in his heart it felt like the opening of a door he had never dared to imagine before. That night, lying in bed, he replayed the moment again and again. He had seen something in his father's eyes, a flicker of doubt, maybe even fear. Not fear of Daniel's defiance, but fear of himself, of what he had become. For the first time, Daniel realized that his father was not unshakable stone. He was a man, broken by his own father, chained by his own philosophy, repeating the cycle because he didn't know another way. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. If his father was just a man, then maybe his rules were not absolute. Maybe love did not have to mean pain. Maybe the cycle could be broken. But with that realization came a new burden. If Daniel broke free, if he chose another path, it would mean more than saving himself. It would mean carrying the responsibility of ending something that had been passed down for generations. Could he do it? Or would the shadows of discipline always cling to him, shaping every decision, every relationship, every future child he might one day have? He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in his life, he felt the faint pulse of freedom beating in his chest. He had spoken. He had resisted. And though the scars of punishment would remain, he now carried a seed of something his father could never control: choice. The rain finally broke outside, tapping against his window like soft drums. Daniel lay awake in the darkness, listening, his eyes wide open. The punishment had not come, but something else had: a shift, a change. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with conflict, maybe even more pain. But he also knew this: his life would never be the same again. Years passed and Daniel left that house behind. College gave him a freedom he had never tasted before. For the first time, he could decide when to sleep, when to eat, how to live without reporting every step. At first, the absence of control felt strange, even frightening. He would wake in the middle of the night, expecting to hear his father's footsteps in the hallway, his heart pounding with an old, phantom fear. But no footsteps ever came. Slowly, he began to rebuild himself. He laughed more. He made friends, real friends, who saw him not as a model of discipline, but as a human being. And yet, in even those moments of joy, he carried the weight of his past like a silent shadow. In relationships, he struggled. He found himself either too guarded or too demanding. He feared making mistakes, feared being rejected. Sometimes he caught himself using his father's words, his father's tone, and the thought terrified him. He promised himself he would never become that man, never allow punishment to masquerade as love. But the fear of repeating the cycle haunted him. One night, sitting alone in his small apartment, Daniel opened a journal and began to write. He poured out everything, every punishment, every moment of silence, every time he had wanted to scream but couldn't. The words flowed like a flood, years of unspoken pain spilling onto paper. And as he wrote, something inside him shifted. He realized that telling the story was itself an act of freedom. By naming the pain, he was taking power away from it. In time, Daniel became a man others admired. He was thoughtful, disciplined, but also compassionate. He had learned to read people's emotions deeply, to sense their unspoken struggles. What once had been survival skills became empathy. His scars became lessons. His silence became wisdom. And yet the memory of his father remained complicated. There were days when Daniel hated him, days when he felt grateful for the resilience those punishments had carved into him, and days when he simply felt sadness for the boy who had been broken and for the man who had never learned another way to raise a child. The true turning point came years later when Daniel stood in a hospital room holding his newborn son. the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his own, fragile and trusting. Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he whispered, "I will never let you feel what I felt. Never." In that moment, the cycle ended. The punishment that once defined him no longer held power. He had the choice his father never claimed, the choice to build strength without fear, discipline without cruelty, love without pain. Daniel's life did not become perfect. Healing was not a straight path. There were nights when old nightmares returned, when he woke sweating, hearing echoes of the cane striking air. There were moments when anger surged inside him and he feared he might one day lose control. But every time he returned to that promise, every time he remembered the boy who had once whispered to Amir, "One day, I'll be free." Now standing as a father himself, Daniel knew the truth. Freedom was not something handed down. It was something fought for, seized in defiance, protected with every choice that followed. And so he raised his son with love, with patience, with guidance that never came at the end of a cane. And each time he saw the boy smile without fear, he felt another chain break inside himself. Looking back, Daniel realized that the punishment, which once seemed unbearable, had indeed changed his life forever, but not in the way his father intended. It had taught him the cost of cruelty, the emptiness of control, the hunger a child carries when love is withheld. It had shown him everything he never wanted to become. And perhaps in that strange, twisted way, it gave him a gift, the clarity to choose differently. Because sometimes the deepest pain does not only break you, it teaches you how to rebuild. So, when you think about Daniel's story, ask yourself, what do we pass on to those who come after us? Fear or freedom? Pain or love? Sometimes the harshest punishments don't just shape a child's behavior, they shape the course of generations.